Well, it looks like numbers are kind of holding, and we'll let people come in as they wish. I don't want to make you sit and wait, respecting your time. So I want to say welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining this month's webinar. I anticipate almost all of you know me by now, but Don Watruba, the Executive Director for MASB. We also have Brad Banasek, our legal counsel on, Jen Smith, our Director of Government Relations, and Stacy Bogard, our Assistant Director of Communications and Public Relations, on to answer questions. I'm going to do kind of a brief intro today to the webinar, and we're going to have Brad take up most of the space, both Brad and you asking him questions. And also we will give some opportunity maybe for districts to share how they are approaching things. Clearly, you might have all been hoping for not much to change before the end of the school year so that the boards wouldn't be stuck in the position that you now probably find yourself. But over the last couple of weeks, a lot of things have come out that are making you wonder what to do at your district level. Some of you have already made decisions. Others of you are trying to figure out this week what that will be. We had some changes now about 2 weeks ago as a result of an attorney general. I don't know if it was a formal opinion or written letter. I'll let Brad get into that. But that came out. And then late last week, we of course had the governor or MDHHS's most recent order on masks. And I think even though they weren't specific, the first one was specific to schools, the governor's or MDHHS's most recent order wasn't. It definitely has a huge impact on schools as we are changing for the rest of Michigan citizens when we wear masks and when we don't wear masks. And so we really thought, hey, let's try to get in front of all of you as early as possible to help you make decisions at the local level. What I will say, I think Brad says it often in phone calls, and what we say often at MASB as you are here listening to Brad talk about the legal parameters. Clearly, I trust Brad's judgment from a legal perspective, and he and I have worked together for 24 years, and I feel pretty comfortable in what he knows about education law in Michigan. But in the end, MASB doesn't represent you from a legal perspective. So as you look at making changes in your district, I would encourage you having the conversation with your local legal counsel, or in fact, even your insurance carrier, just to make sure that they feel comfortable with the direction you're going as a district. I did have the opportunity last week to talk to one of the large insurance carriers in the state. And this was before the MDHHS order that came out at the end of the week. But where they were coming down was really looking at this and saying, from an insurance perspective, they're going to represent you no matter what you do. But when it gets to the idea of what are your chances if somebody's going to sue you, and what's going to happen, where they were coming down was, as long as in their minds you weren't doing anything contrary to law, and the district took the time to put a plan in place. So that's not just saying, oh, we've got some flexibility, we're just going to eliminate everything that we're requiring right now, but that there's a plan in place based on a district doing its due diligence and making decisions out of that, and likely in concert with a local health department or another health entity, that they felt pretty good about where a district would stand from a liability standpoint from insurance. So, I think that's, where MASB has been over the last couple of weeks as things are changing, trying to provide you the information that we feel will keep you in a good place from a legal perspective, while, continuing to urge caution as you make decisions to make sure you're consulting with people in the health industry and then locally with your legal counsel. I'm going to try to handle with Stacy today any questions that you might have during this. Please throw them up in the chat. We're going to have Brad do a general intro of where things stand right now on orders versus guidelines versus the most recent order. I'm sure he can get into the conversation between at a school district level, the difference between kids and the difference between your employees. and how, like what rules are in place for each of them in that space, or orders that are in place. And so please start putting questions in the chat as early as you want. If some of them get answered by his initial presentation, I'll skip over them, and then we'll start, pitching the questions to Brad and letting him do a response. Once we get to a place, if we get to that place where a question seems to be answered, if we have time, we'll open it up just to have districts share a little bit about, what you've made a decision to do and maybe how you made it for those districts that haven't really got there yet. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to start a conversation with all of you. And again, I just appreciate all of you being on today. Appreciate your interest in doing a good job as a school board members, and reaching out, and superintendents, because I know we have soups on today too, and reaching out to MASB to try to help you kind of navigate this process. I know it's not easy, and we're at a time where everybody wants to be doing graduation ceremonies and awards and not worrying about whether kids should be wearing masks or your employees should be wearing masks and how far apart. But we are where we are, and hopefully we're on the road out of the pandemic. And if nothing else, that is a good place for us to be. So Brad, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Don. And hello, everyone. Really glad to be here today. And yeah, lots of information to share. As Don mentioned, there are a lot of pieces, to the puzzle relating to face mask, quarantining, and contact tracing. And I'm going to be discussing a number of those pieces today. You have the emergency order, you have county orders, you have laws that are still in effect, you have MIOSHA rules, and then of course you have the CDC guidelines. So just a lot of information to take in, a lot of guidance that school districts need to be considering. And I did mention your own local plans as well. Under law, you're required to adopt a COVID-19 response learning plan, and you're required to adopt a COVID-19 employment plan as well. So you have even your local rules and guidelines that you need to follow. So just a lot of information that should be considered, and my intent here today is to hopefully provide everyone with the information so you're able to make informed decisions at the local level. MASB is not going to tell you what is the right or wrong decision today. We're just going to provide you with information so you're able to make an informed decision at the local level, certainly in consultation between your administration and your Board of Education. So what I'd like to do first is go over the emergency order that was issued last Friday, and kind of look at the a few new provisions that come into play here. And obviously you're aware of the mask provision. We'll be talking about that in a bit. But before doing that, wanted to kind of go over the definitions here, because with these orders, they always seem to sneak in some new terms and new definitions. And you have to be aware of those, because those certainly need to be taken into consideration. And what I'd like to bring your attention to is on the definition page of the emergency order, you see this new term here, establishment. It's definition E, and you see that it means a business, store, office, government office, school, organized event, or other operation. This is a new term, and this is a new definition that is included in the most recent emergency order. So this certainly comes into play when we look at a provision a little bit later on in the emergency order. So just remember that this new term and definition is included here. And also, kind of reading this term narrowly as well, while it does include school and organized event, I'm not sure if it means school board meeting. And that's kind of the first topic we're going to be discussing first as we work through the order, what type of impact the order has on your school board meeting, which I think is kind of the easy issue today. And then we'll get into the more complicated issues, is how it impacts your staff and your students. So just keep that definition in mind. Then you have this definition down here at the bottom, definition J. Now this was in the previous emergency order, but now it has more significance. What constitutes a fully vaccinated person? Someone who for at least 2 weeks has passed after they received their final dose and FDA approved or authorized COVID-19 vaccination. So a couple of important terms and definitions there I just wanted to bring to your attention. Now, the gathering limitations are still in play. These have been in existence for quite some time. These emergency orders, they really haven't changed, but you can see the limitations here for an indoor gathering and an outdoor gathering as well. And what we'll find out later in the order is that indoor gatherings are still subject to a mask requirement, but now you see no mention of the mask requirement relating to an outdoor gathering. So no matter what type of outdoor gathering it is, where it's included, where it's held, mask requirement no longer applies to an outdoor gathering. That is nowhere to be found in the most recent emergency order. And then you'll see the limitations here to the limitations on the gathering restriction, which type of situations don't apply to those limitations. And at the very bottom here, you'll see meetings held in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. So, based upon that language, which was inserted a couple of orders ago, your board meetings are no longer subject to the gathering restrictions that are found. So that means that are found in the order. So you don't have to worry about, that 25-person limitation for an indoor gathering. That no longer applies to a school board meeting. But what you do have here now is this provision listed on, subsection 5 here. Establishments abide by the following density limitations. So I just looked at that definition of establishment. I noted that it didn't specifically identify a school board meeting, but the previous FAQs essentially said that your board meetings were restricted by this 50% capacity limitation. The FAQs are not binding. Only the emergency order is binding under law. So I guess erring on the side of caution, I would say it's likely a best practice that when you're holding your board meeting, if you're able to comply with that 50% capacity limitation where that meeting is being held, that would certainly be a best practice. If you go beyond 50% for a school board meeting, I'm not saying that violates the order. It's not quite clear, but someone could possibly make that argument. And then on that note, we will now go down to the provision on face masks. I guess before doing that, though, just a quick point on organized sports gatherings. Not many changes in the order on sports gatherings, but I just want to bring to your attention of how the issue of quarantining and contact tracing got in the headlines with the last couple of weeks, where it wasn't required by law. And it was this last provision here under the organized sports gathering restrictions, subsection D, that kind of led to that opinion, where the let them play folks were challenging the rapid testing requirements under the emergency order. And you could see this provision clearly says that anyone that's participating in sports practice competition, ages 13 and 19, are prohibited unless they go through a testing program. So the testing program is quite required by the emergency order, and then it's identified in DHHS guidance. Okay. Now, in that guidance, you'll also find contact tracing and quarantining guidance, but that's not a requirement here in the order. Okay, the only requirement here in the order is the testing. So the contact tracing and the quarantining is not required. That's just in the guidance. But because the testing, which is clarified in the guidance, is required here in the order, that's why it was included that yes, the testing is required under law, but DHHS in that case basically admitted, no, we can't enforce the quarantining and the contact tracing if that's not required in the emergency order. So just wanted to clarify that and how that opinion came to be the last couple of weeks. So the face mask requirement, you can see if you're holding a person responsible for the of an establishment, so a person responsible for a school district must prohibit gatherings of any kind unless the person makes a good faith effort to ensure that all persons at that establishment comply with Section 6A, which is the mask requirement. So Michigan still has a mask mandate, but now we have additional exceptions to that mask mandate. And the exception that is receiving the most attention is exception A, that individuals are fully vaccinated. And then of course you have C as well, which has been an exception for quite some time. Now, a person responsible, for a school district event, a school district gathering, under the order is required to make a good faith effort to ensure that someone complies with this mask requirement, and they can comply with it obviously by wearing a face mask. But the other way someone can comply is by fitting into one of these exceptions. And how do you determine that? Well, this is the only guidance that we have so far, is how you can determine, or you enforce the mask requirement, whether someone fitting into the exception or whether they're required to wear a mask or not, is that you can post a sign indicating that if you're fully vaccinated, you're not required to wear a mask, or if you fit into one of the exceptions listed in the emergency order, you're not required to wear a mask. You can ask the person who's not wearing a mask if they fall into a specified exception. So that is permitted under the order as well. What's also permitted is that you require all individuals, patrons and employees to wear a face mask, regardless if they've been vaccinated or not. Or you could adopt a policy designed to ensure compliance with this section as well. So first, as I mentioned, let's apply this to school board meetings, okay? I mean, I think that's the easier issue. So your school board meetings are more open than your school district buildings, okay? Your school board meetings are essentially a public forum. They're a limited public forum, but they're more of a public forum than obviously the inside of your school buildings, whether it be for an instructional activity or an athletic activity. So you're able to put more restrictions on folks when they come into a school board, when they come to your school building, whether they're there for an after-school activity or fine arts events or an athletic activity. You're not able to put those same type of requirements or mandates that you can impose on parents that as far as individuals attending a school board meeting. So with that said, I think probably the best practice for your school board meetings at this point, until we get additional guidance, maybe from the Department of Health and Human Services or some other entity, post a sign, okay? If you fit within one of the mask exceptions, you may attend the meeting without wearing a mask. What I would not advise at this point is having a strict everyone must wear a mask requirement for your school board meetings. That's been a very obviously controversial issue, and I think there would be difficulty in enforcing that, particularly now with the exception that if you're a fully vaccinated person, you don't have to wear a mask. So I think with your board meetings going forward, best practice would be allowing for the exception that individuals who are fully vaccinated, that they're able to attend your meetings without a mask, and ensuring that you have signage that indicates that. So on that note, Don, I think I will take a break here and answer any questions that may be in the chat box.
All right, Brad, and we have a lot of questions, and I'm going to start with one just from what you just finished, because it's kind of addressed in the questions already. So if we're in a board meeting situation like you just addressed, I mean, one of the questions I would have, so we've posted that the exception applies. Could in essence, the person responsible for the meeting, like it talks about, could a school district ask for proof of vaccination to not wear a mask in a board meeting?
I think for a board meeting, I would not go that direction. We'll address that issue when we get to individuals gaining access to a school activity. But for a school board meeting, I think signage and then possibly just asking whether they fit into one of the exceptions would be appropriate. But as far as requiring them, having a passport policy, so to speak, until we get further guidance on that issue, I would not require that for access to a public meeting.
Gotcha. And that was just going to ask, your differentiation is because it is a public meeting as opposed to a somewhat private event in a school.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go right up to the top. Are schools required to follow mask restrictions in schools? Are they only strongly recommended? So you just went through it. Masks are very much in the order, so they are required to follow them. I'll ask the differentiation then is, how does this apply? Now we're in the school district, not at a board meeting. How do the mask mandates apply between students and employees of the school district when it relates to the mask mandate and then the exceptions?
Well, okay, so you still have a mask mandate that would apply to all gatherings within a school building, whether during instructional time or not during instructional time. And you have the exceptions that apply to that. So if you are a fully vaccinated student under the order, you would not have to wear a mask during the school day. However, a school district may still require that, under the provision which states, in order to make a good faith effort to ensure that a district is complying with the gathering requirement of wearing a face mask in a gathering, you can ask individuals or require face masks for all individuals who are involved in that gathering. So that would obviously apply to a student. So yeah, you would, whether the administration sets that rule, or it's a board policy, I think you could go either way with it. I guess you would look at, I can't imagine many districts have a policy that specifically addresses that would restrict the administration from adopting a rule, but that's a possibility. But certainly you would take a look at your current policies to see what would be required in going forward on that particular issue. Now with staff members, a couple, I guess just the MIOSHA rules come into play. And I can certainly cover that now. I was going to cover that later, but in response to this question, we'll go ahead and bring that up right now. So you currently have MIOSHA emergency rules that have not been rescinded. But these rules have not been amended to be consistent with the current emergency order. So the example is the MIOSHA rule indicates that your employees must wear a face mask if they're unable to keep within 6 feet of other individuals at work. Okay, so think of a staff member having a 6-foot buffer around him or her the entire day, and if someone breaks into that buffer, you have to wear a face mask. And with a teacher, I imagine that would be very difficult, right? However, the MIOSHA folks just came out yesterday and indicated that they will not be enforcing any MIOSHA rules that are contrary to the current emergency order. So I interpret that to mean that if your staff members have been fully vaccinated, they would not be required to wear a mask under the emergency order, obviously, or under the MIOSHA rules as based upon that statement issued by MIOSHA on Monday. However, I mean, if you're really erring on the side of caution and you're saying we're going to be in complete compliance with the emergency rules, we're not going to go by what the department is saying without the rules being amended first, then you would require your staff members to wear masks according to the rules.
Is that statement available on their website, Brad?
It is. I was going to show it here, but then I lost it within transition. But if you just go to the MIOSHA webpage, it's indicated right there. And that statement was just issued yesterday afternoon.
I'll go to the next question. I know the answer, but I'll let you. Is there a mandate for teachers to be vaccinated?
No, there is not. And any type of requirement would have to be negotiated. Certainly, that is an issue relating to your working conditions, and I'm not aware of any districts that have gone down that route yet.
So we have a question that's further down related to employees, and it directly relates to the piece that you just mentioned on MIOSHA. I'll start with the employees, and if we go down the road that a district adopts the current standard, we'll call it, that an employee that has been fully vaccinated based on the definition doesn't have to wear a mask, can a school district ask for them to show that they have proof of vaccination?
I think so. With staff members and students, it's a bit different, than a member of the general public attending a public board meeting. And again, I think you would want to codify that in an administrative rule or in a policy. Now, with staff members, might be a bargainable issue. Whether that's a mandatory subject of bargaining or not. I know, most safety requirements are bargainable issues, so that may be something that would have to be bargained in terms of enforcing that on a staff member. So, the issue would be, okay, require it for staff. Staff says, no, I don't want to show that. And then, okay, then there has to be a consequence for not showing it. If it's a discipline consequence, then you could have a ULP filed claiming that was a rule that needed to be bargained. So that would have to be a consideration.
But of course, in that situation, then the district could default to saying, we're just going to leave the requirement in place as a district that all staff members wear a mask. And that, so the union has to make a choice. Do you want the freedom and flexibility with proof, or do you want to have everybody remaining wearing a mask?
Yeah.
You mentioned on the student side, I read a news report recently of a district that has adopted their plan to allow students that are vaccinated to be in school without a mask, but they are also requiring that that they have proof of vaccination, and they will keep that confidential, likely where they keep other health information related to students in their file. What do you feel on that space?
Yeah, I think that's legitimate. So, kind of compare it to, how we've handled previous, vaccinations. Okay. With now, when you enroll in a school, you have to show proof of certain vaccinations. And if you've opted out of those vaccinations, you have to go through a certain process for opting out of those vaccinations and share a document that shows that you went through that process, and that is being admitted into the school. So arguably, if you don't show that documentation, technically you can't enroll in the district. Now in this case, we're just talking about someone wearing a mask or not. We're not talking about not allowing them to come to school. So the due process issue is certainly not as great in this type of situation, because the penalty, so to speak, of not showing the documentation of vaccination is simply wearing a mask. You're still getting your education, and you're not losing out on any type of property interest. So technically, due process isn't implicated under the circumstances. So I think that's a valid rule. Clearly, could be enforceable. And I think districts started to do that a week or so ago when the order came out on the rapid testing. If you were a fully vaccinated athlete, you didn't have to go through the rapid testing. And I think districts were either having the picture of the vaccination card on a phone or requesting it, to be downloaded on some type of database that the district would have access to. But again, yeah, that would be a student record, so it should be kept confidential. But yeah, I don't see, I think that's completely different than having a passport, so to speak, to a public meeting.
In that space, do you feel, I think you've addressed, like, typically school districts are following more FERPA when it relates to kids versus HIPAA regulations. Because one of the questions, is it a HIPAA violation to ask for that students, whether they've been vaccinated or not?
It is not. So when you're dealing with HIPAA and FERPA, FERPA supersedes HIPAA. And the feds have made it clear that when you're dealing with medical information that is maintained by a school district, HIPAA does not apply. You're dealing with FERPA rather than HIPAA. So on this issue of whether a student has been vaccinated or not, you don't have to worry about HIPAA. You just worry about FERPA.
Another question related to, I think it's more related to the employee side of things. I actually had to look this up for MASB too. They asked the question about, there are some ADA pieces that relate to employees in either asking them to be vaccinated or in fact to share their vaccination information. I can say, at least from my perspective, digging into it for MASB, what I received as guidance is, you can ask the question, but ask them not to disclose any information that would, disclose related to disability, because that is something that you're not supposed to be asking about. And they can still ask, answer that question or say, I haven't been vaccinated because of X, Y, or Z, but they still don't have to say what the disability is. Does that comport with kind of the space that you understand?
Yeah, when requiring or asking staff members about a medical issue, or in this case, vaccination, yeah, two laws you really need to take into consideration. As you mentioned, ADA, where someone has a disability that prevents them from getting a vaccine, certainly then you would have to make an accommodation for that person. Okay. And whether the disability has to be disclosed in terms of accommodating that individual, or whether the accommodation simply relates to whether the person does in-person work or virtual work, that's a whole process that you would go through in addressing that issue if someone does have a disability that prevents him or her from getting a vaccine. And then the other issue is the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, where you can't infringe upon someone's religious rights in terms of making an employment decision. And if someone has a religious belief in regard to receiving a vaccination, and if they strongly believe that is in violation of one of their religious tenets, then that certainly needs to be a consideration as well in looking at that issue.
Okay. We have a question. We've seen districts now offering vaccine clinics for their students, particularly now that they've dropped it down to age 12. Do you see any legal implications for districts hosting a clinic on their site for students and adults to be vaccinated?
I really don't. No, I think districts have been doing this for a couple of weeks. I haven't heard any legal issues in terms of a district holding a vaccination clinic. So no, I really can't think of any legal issues that could come into play.
Looking at this question from Lisa, CDC recommendations that school maintain mask requirements. You've already addressed staff meetings, board meetings, you've already addressed their ability to not wear them if they, Dan asked a question about HIPAA, which I've already asked. Here's one more directly, specific situation, 4th grade field trip, 3 days up north, 30+ parents, 30+ students. Health departments not saying we don't recommend doing the trip. Superintendent not recommending until health department approves. SETSEG saying that it would be ill-advised to go against the health department order. true and stated the most conservative approach was to follow the health department recommendation. Majority of the board has voiced that they would like to still allow the trip to happen and have parents sign some type of waiver saying they understand that the school district is going against these recommendations of superintendent, health department, that sort of thing. You know, clearly they're likely opening up some liability issues in this space. Does the waiver help at all, or do you fall into the camp with everybody else and think that they probably best practice would be not to move forward?
Yeah, I think clearly the best practice would be not to move forward. I know that's difficult from a parent and student perspective that really wish to go on with this field trip. But if you're asking me from a pure risk management perspective and legal liability perspective, yeah, the best practice clearly would be to follow the recommendations of the county health department, following the recommendations of your insurance provider and your legal counsel. To me, there's just too many opinions there that you're kind of going against to try to make that field trip happen. I mean, again, I guess the board can make the decision what it wants to make on that issue, but it sounds like the board is kind of the outlier in that situation, with the administration, obviously wanting to follow the guidance from SETSEG and from TRUN. I guess based on that transition into county orders, Don, really quick before we get to a few more questions, I just wanted to touch upon the significance of your county health department issuing an order. And I brought an order up here on the screen, and this is not a recommendation, so this is an order, and this is the local county health departments were essentially told by DHHS is that, okay, now you're responsible for the issue of quarantining and contact tracing. At the state level, we're not going to get involved with that. Our state orders don't involve that issue. But if on a local level, at a county level, if a county believes that districts should still be quarantining and following contact tracing requirements, it's up to the county health department to require that. So here's an example, from Saginaw County, and you'll see the authority that it's relying on to issue this order, sections 2451 and 2453 from the Public Health Code. 2451 relates to when there's an imminent danger to your county and the folks within a county. The health department has the ability to issue an order that addresses that imminent danger. And then 2453 refers to epidemic procedures that may be implemented by a county health department to address something like COVID-19. So you see the determination that has been made by the county health department here, and then it went on to issue this order where it is requiring quarantining anyone who is involved in close contact for at least 10 days, or any such duration as may be required by written public notice issued by the county health department. Notice that it does include some exceptions down here at the bottom relating to folks who have been fully vaccinated, had COVID-19 within the previous 90 days, or 90 days, or the healthcare worker who has a confirmed case of COVID-19. So this is enforceable under law. So even though our emergency order doesn't have any restrictions, requirements related to contact tracing and quarantining, you may have a county health department that issued requirements. And again, this is binding under law. The county could pursue a court order to get this enforced if a school district goes against it. So just because at the state level, you're no longer required to follow quarantining and contact tracing guidance from DHHS, look at your county health department and ensure that you're following all your county health orders as well.
All right, Brad, I think you addressed this earlier, but I'll just double check. board meetings held inside of a high school auditorium, best practice is 50% capacity rules, what they would follow in that place?
I would say that's best practice. Yeah, the order is a bit unclear on that now that we have new language that arguably could be interpreted that a board meeting is constitutes an establishment for the purpose of the order, and establishments are subject to that 50% capacity limitations as determined by your local fire marshal.
Is 6 feet of distance still required at a board meeting?
When you look at the order, I would interpret it as being no. The gathering, that appears to be a gathering restriction. So let's go back to the order here and kind of show you kind of how I'm coming up with that analysis. So, the exceptions here from the gathering requirements or limitations, gatherings of a public body held in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. And then D, as a condition of hosting a gathering under this order, you must design the gathering to encourage and maintain physical distancing and ensure that persons not part of the same group maintain 6 feet of distance. So when you look at that last provision, it appears that it's referring to the gathering, restrictions. Whereas, so you're hosting a gathering subject to the restrictions under this order. So you have 25 people present, you would have to have, those folks maintain 6 feet of distance from one another. But a public meeting falls outside of those gathering restrictions. Now, again, best practice, I would say have social distancing, go ahead with, you've been doing 6 feet of distance from one another at your board meetings. I would continue that, but as a best practice, but it doesn't appear that it's required by the emergency order.
All right. If the venue of a school board meeting requires wearing a mask, shouldn't the board follow the venue's instructions? Clearly, outside, if you were you were hosting it at a conference room facility or something, that's one question. And I think the answer probably is at that point, you have to follow the rules of the facility you're in. Right. I'm guessing they're referring, if I'm in a school district and the school district has maintained a mask policy without exceptions, would you still say that because it's a public meeting that you would follow the order to say if they can say that they're vaccinated, they still don't need to wear a mask?
Based upon, I guess, what I'm reading, what I'm seeing, I just think a school board is going to be asking for more difficulty in having a public meeting if it goes that direction. I mean, every day we're hearing more entities opening up. Meyer today, or yesterday, indicated that you're no longer required to wear a mask in Meyer if you've been fully vaccinated. I think it would be a very difficult rule for a school board to enforce at this point, based upon kind of where we're at present time. That's kind of, and I suppose certainly if you believe that if there's clearly a health and safety interest at this point that where that rule needs to be followed, then by all means, enforce it. But I think kind of where we're at right now with this issue, I think it would be a difficult rule to enforce at a board meeting.
If a district chooses to defy the mask mandate, what are possible consequences to the district? And this goes to the point that I made earlier in talking to one of the large insurers. If there's no plan in place that you've decided to make changes because of X, Y, and Z and working with your health department, and there is a breakout or sickness that, results in, whatever, hospitalization or death, I mean, there's clearly probably some liability space in not following health department or state guidelines.
Yeah, well, let's just start out with the violation of the order first. See here, I pulled up that, if you don't follow the emergency order, and clearly there's a mask mandate, and it's unlikely that all your staff members and all your students are fully vaccinated, which would allow you, to have everyone attend without wearing a mask and come to work without wearing a mask. So by lifting or not complying with the mask mandate, yeah, you're violating the order. You can see here, punishable misdemeanor of imprisonment not more than 6 months or $200. Also, there is an additional civil fine for that as well. See on the second page here, up to $1,000 for how many violations that is incurred by violating the order. And then, yeah, from the governmental immunity side of it, if you're not following the emergency order, which has the authority under law, then essentially you're waiving your protection on governmental immunity. So you couldn't come back and claim. This was a discretionary decision. We had authority under law to make this decision. Thus, we cannot be sued for negligence if someone is injured as a result of the decision we've made. You could throw that argument out the window because you don't have the authority under law, to not follow the emergency order. Now, let's say it's a recommendation. That's when you get into a completely different analysis. That's what we looked at earlier, Don, on that question with the field trip. That was a recommendation from the county health department. There was nothing in the order that appeared to prohibit, that field trip. And I guess the remedy, to that was being proposed, was the waiver. If we somehow lose our governmental immunity by not following a recommendation, can we protect ourselves by a waiver? And yes, waivers do provide some sense of protection, more so from a foreseeability, standpoint, where someone is accepting the risks. You have them sign the waiver that, okay, I'm accepting these risks that are associated with going on this field trip, that are contrary to the recommendations of our county health department. So that kind of the legal analysis in terms of a legal mandate and a legal recommendation. And I guess the follow-up question would be, what about the CDC recommendations, right? What type of liability could be imposed if we don't follow the CDC recommendations? Because right after we had our emergency order that created the fully vaccinated mask exception, the very next day, the CDC came out and said, okay, we see states are lifting mask mandates. However, our recommendation is to continue with the prevention strategies that districts have been following for the 2021 school year. What happens if you don't follow the CDC recommendation? Again, I think someone could argue that you're being negligent in doing that, but unless there's something in the law that says districts shall follow the CDC guidelines on this issue, I don't believe you would be waiving your governmental immunity by not following the CDC recommendation. So that's what you would have to look at. I did a brief search on Michigan law. There only appears to be one provision in the law that says, CDC guidance should be followed on this particular matter. It was the COVID-19 Employment Rights Act. So that would involve your staff members rather than your students.
Speaking of staff members, where should staff's vaccine records be stored? I know that they're not supposed to be held in a personnel file because that can be accessible by other people. Where do they put them?
I would put them in a separate confidential file that is separate from the personnel file. That because the personnel files, for the most part, they're going to be FOIable, and you don't want someone to mistakenly disclose medical information. So a separate locked file considered to be highly confidential would be sufficient, would be my suggestion.
Do you need parental approval to vaccinate a student? I'm guessing they're talking about somebody under the age of 18, because if they're 18, you don't need it. And it would likely be at a clinic at a school district.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure unless the student's emancipated or under guardianship, I'm not sure if the power of attorney would allow for consent for a vaccination, but yeah, clearly you would want parental approval for that.
I know our district that last week ran a clinic did require that they not only have approval, but the parent had to attend with the student in person, because that was one of the questions too. That's got to be one where go to your local district attorney and get final guidance on that one. But I think Brad seems is in the right space, which is schools don't perform medical procedures unless there's some kind of underlying parental consent or parental parent.
And I'm pretty sure the individual administering the vaccine would not provide it with, without identification if the person's 18, if you're under 18, who is giving consent for this. So I think there would be that protection as well.
So here we got a question. What about parents storming board meetings and demanding freedoms? Other states are opened up. What steps are being looked at to untangle schools from enforcing quote unquote recommendations that don't affect our county or area? And Brad, it's actually a legitimate question. It's one of the spaces you and I talked about ahead of time. So clearly now we do have the order that you just went through, and we had guidelines that were in place regarding how many feet away from each other, quarantining rules and things along those lines. So that actually is kind of changed to give districts more freedom in some of those places. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, you're correct. And we have over 600 districts in Michigan, and they're all different. And you may have different decisions being made, and I guess how the community plays a part in that equation and the decision-making process is going to be up to the administration and the board. If it's just local folks, yeah, certainly I think that can be taken into consideration. What we're seeing though in the age of social media, you're having protests that are being organized by folks who come into your community, who are not part of your community, and overtaking board meetings and kind of threatening, school districts and school boards. And, those aren't your community members, and, who knows what are driving those folks. But yeah, if it's your community, it's certainly worth having, conversation and see where the community's at on some of these issues. But again, the school board represents the community, and, you should be making decisions that are in the best interest of your students, your staff, and your school district. That's kind of what it comes down to.
So, and Heidi, in asking that question, I know you put recommendations in quotes. Clearly Brad's went through the order. The mask mandate still remains outside of those that are vaccinated. If people are coming into board meetings and complaining about that from a freedom perspective, Brad's also explained what happens if you don't follow the law. So that piece has to happen. But you now have that flexibility within your community, and likely still with your local health department, to talk about, is the 6 feet rule from a quarantining standpoint appropriate, or do we want to go to a smaller number, and is the health department okay with that? Is the 14-day mandate for quarantining what you want to stick with? Is it 10 days like Saginaw's health department has laid out? Is it 6 days with a negative test? Like, those are things now that districts are having the ability to have their own input on. And as Brad said, who you work with to create that new document is up to the district. Very clearly, I think everybody would say, bring your county health officials into the discussion anyways, so that when you adopt, I don't know if rule is the right word, Brad, but when you adopt the rule or policy, you can point back at the process that you went to get there, and that it was based on you doing due diligence as a district, not just on this is what we're going to set and call it good.
Yeah, I agree with that, Don. And, that issue that Heidi brought up kind of reminds me of an email, or I guess you can call it a FOIA request that's been making the rounds to a number of board members, threatening them, saying that they're in violation of their oath of office by requiring face masks. And the individual and that sends that email, points to a law in the school code that says, students shall not wear or be subject to a restraint that hinders their breathing. And they're claiming that, that requiring a mask is in violation of the school code. And that's clearly not the case. The provision that email relates to refers to seclusion and restraint. And there are definitions as far as what constitutes a device that could limit someone's breathing. And that definition clearly doesn't cover a medical face mask or any type of face mask. So don't be threatened by those emails. They're bogus. They're not supported by any authority. You're not violating anyone's constitutional rights by enforcing a mask requirement under the order. But again, just kind of wanted to bring that out there now.
Limits on outdoor events, graduations, convocations, honors, are they still subject to 50% or are they just subject to distancing limitations?
So yeah, you still have limitations under the executive order that apply to outdoor gatherings. So those have not been lifted. So again, mask requirements have been lifted for any outdoor gatherings, but you still have capacity limitations for your outdoor gatherings.
If a school board meets in City Hall still requires masks.
Yeah, I guess I would have a conversation with City Hall about that, see how they're handling other public meetings, if other public bodies are enforcing that mask requirement, regardless of whether you've been vaccinated or not. They'll follow their policy on that.
All right. What are districts doing about prom and how do the orders affect proms?
Again, the most recent order doesn't make any doesn't have any changes that would impact gatherings relating to a prom. You're still subject to the gathering limitations, whether it be held indoor or outdoors. I guess now though, if you have students who are fully vaccinated, they may not be required to wear a mask at prom, but there was guidance issued on end of year events for school districts that related to that covered graduation and prom. That guidance, based upon how I'm reading the current order and what that guidance was based on in the previous order, that guidance is still legitimate and should be followed. And the argument there for, or I guess the specific guidance for proms would be cohorting. Groups of students within groups of 6, and having them just be together in groups while holding a prom. But yeah, no longer required to wear a mask if they've been vaccinated.
Howard's asking a question that I think is just more prognostication on our part. Once final FDA approval is obtained, do you think that the Department of Health and Human Services will add the COVID vaccination to the required childhood vaccinations? Jen, you probably could chime in. MDHHS is, of course, not separate from the political world. My initial reaction would be I'd be surprised if they added it in the near future. I don't know, Jen, if you have another take on that, though.
It can be done through rules, so it doesn't have to go through the legislative process, which gives it more possibility. Unfortunately, we've already seen preemptive bills introduced in the legislature that ban about anything having to do with vaccinations, asking a person, basing employment upon it, making rules regarding the COVID-19 vaccination, anything like that. There are already bills that are introduced. So there's a bill sitting and waiting that would ban DHHS from doing rules regarding the COVID-19 vaccination. But I don't know if those have any more legs than adding it to rules. So it'll be more interesting to see once it does have final approval, what DHHS does.
All right. I want to thank a number of our people are posting what they have done in proms, outdoor proms, testing of prom attendees. That's helpful, I think, for other districts that are considering it. Brad, a vaccination question. If a parent has already followed the required paperwork to have kids exempt from all vaccines, and our district decides to go with fully vaccinated people don't have to wear masks, do the kids that have declared their exemption, are they exempt from wearing masks, or would they still need to wear a mask?
That paperwork was specific to the vaccines that are required by the department, currently required, the HHS. And I think it's comparing apples and oranges, in my opinion. Again, we're talking about enrolling in a school district and showing proof of vaccination compared to just whether you're wearing a mask or not. And I think that's a completely different issue. So if someone has filed their religious exemption for the DHHS vaccinations and trying to argue that that applies to the COVID-19 vaccination, I don't know if that flies, just because this, the issue is completely different. One is about enrolling in school. The other is whether you're required to wear a face mask or not.
Yeah, because they're exempt from they're declaring exemption from the vaccination, not necessarily the mask mandate. That's in some ways a separate issue. You're not making them get the COVID vaccine. You're saying if you don't have it, you just wear a mask.
Yeah.
Someone said last week, I'd answer this, but I'll let you. Someone last week said, the Attorney General said we don't have to follow the health department. I have no idea if this is true or not.
Well, it's the guidance, okay? The guidance on contact tracing and quarantining. That's what that referred to. It was not referring to the emergency order.
Any idea if this might be a Jen question, if MDHHS will be updating their end of year events guidance from 5.5 following the mask changes?
You read too fast. I wasn't able to get my text off. At this point, as I'm sitting here, I have not heard anything about that, but I'm checking.
All right, because then they're pointing out, of course, end of year events are starting this week for them. MIOSHA did the statement that they did today, trying to address the order of last week. Maybe we'll see MDHHS do something else to update just to try to make everything consistent with one another in the space, short of, adopting new rules.
And traditionally, Don, they've done FAQs about 5 days after they've issued the order. So there have not been any FAQs yet in regard to this most recent order. So expecting those, again, those are not binding, but they can be helpful as far as interpreting the requirements of the order.
Okay, we are actually at 5 after 1. It's a little bit later than we went, but I know people had questions. I want to follow up one here. So MIOSHA indicated that they will not enforce rules inconsistent with most recent orders. I don't read the statement that way.
Well, it refers to face masks. So I would read it to mean that the face mask requirement in the MIOSHA rules, they would not enforce. But for example, what about, May 24th, based upon our vaccination rates now, we're able to return to work. But the MIOSHA rules still require that any work that can be performed remotely shall be performed remotely. That has to be changed, and I wouldn't, that statement made by MIOSHA, in my opinion, doesn't, cover, an emergency order at this point. It just, the governor just, set those standards for returning to work. So I would still follow that requirement under the emergency order, but I think you would be safe to lift a mask requirement for your staff members, based upon the statement that was made by MIOSHA. That's my interpretation of it.
All right.
We have heard that MIOSHA is going to be updating their guidance, and that should be out on Monday.
All right. I don't want to keep people longer. This has been great. Sorry that we didn't have time to share between districts, but you had a lot of questions and hopefully got a lot of answers. We got a little bit of sharing in the chat. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Hopefully it was helpful. I think it was. And as always, if more questions come up within your districts, at any time, feel free, depending on the topic, to reach out to Jen or Brad or me. And we, whoever needs to answer that question will get that answer back to you. You don't have to wait for the webinars, so we will try to help you whenever you have questions that come up. Thank you all very much. Have a great week. Thank you for everything you're doing.